Hello, welcome back to the channel. Today I'll be continuing my ongoing discussion of Carl Jung's psychological types. More specifically, as the clickbait title states, I have a theory here that the world is not going to want to hear. And I don't mean that hyperbolically, I mean that when any serious scientific theory is put forth, especially one that is counterintuitive and no, actually I'd say counter understood by a certain cultural confusion and an overgeneralization of mankind, human psychology, and psychological types, that in the face of that, I just know for a fact it won't be welcome. These things never are, and it's always been a fight to develop any body of knowledge and to develop any human being in their knowledge. And I could even frame the whole existence of humanity as a fight of one another, individuals within tribes and against other tribes, as a means of correcting and controlling for human psychology. I think I've said it before when I've said things like culture is a reducing valve because it's all contingent upon various repressions of the unpleasant facts of life, as well as the illusions that sustain any culture as a production and work of art that sort of justifies itself by way of the human ego and the way it tends to esteem itself. Yes, this is complex. It's language, it's values, it's how we perceive the world individually, and how that completely is wiped out in the face of mass statistics, mass numbers, and mass humanity, and the mass production of our daily lives. So I wanted to start by saying, again, it's an introvert and extrovert divide. And what this theory is, what the exact theory is proposing, what I'm saying is, it's basically that the Homo sapien isn't one thing. There was already, what made Homo sapien was a mutation that was actually the divide of a subspecies. Meaning, if you look at any pack or herd or tribal animal, right, any animal that congregates in groups, they all generally look and behave the same, because to not look and behave the same, like you look anywhere you look, you will not find a lone zebra, right? Lone zebras don't exist. So the human herd learned the same thing over the course of thousands of years of correcting for and medicalizing and clinicalizing and attacking human psychology, for what people think, what they feel, how all that tends to go. So what I think happened was the original mutation that hit man, the gregarious animal, right? Because just to give you some underpinnings of this theory here, it's not just predicated on Jung's type, which is actually probably, this is the newest addition in a much, thousands of years of understanding of human psychology through certain religions like Buddhism and Eastern traditions, as well as even in the context of Western culture, how these things are understood, um, is that you can look at any place and time and see that various tendencies and functions and arguments are taking place and worlds collide that are variable and different. And the assumption was that you could tie them all together in a way in which they already weren't coexisting in some manner. So to put it shortly and to put it concisely, I'd say there's this idea that mankind has been correcting nature. Mankind has been fixing man. Mankind has been progressing, right? That's supposedly what history is. But what I'm saying is that no, the original mutation that happened was introversion. And it's not like it's any one thing. The focus here, to be clear, are not the functions, because introversion and extroversion are just one of the first divide in personality type. From there, it's further subdivided. With Jung, it's 3 letters, right? So like INT or ENT or ESF, right? And then Myers-Briggs personality typing added the judging and perceiving functions. And then, of course, there's further subdivisions of, in this personality type, the whole thing is predicated on how they're orchestrated, how they feed into one another, what's been called metabolism, interaction, various concepts like that where a function is either oriented towards the outside or the inside or some mediation. And there's further breakdown of the theory saying, oh, technically all types have access to all functions. And it's just these certain ones are always going to predominate that basically leads to a de facto sort of way of perceiving, in which case I would suggest that maybe the Myers-Briggs perception and judging functions are essentially what we would call where nature and nurture meet, meaning nature is that a person is born basically like they have a genetic code, they have a personality type code. It's not literal, it's not real. These are just theories working off thousands of years of data. And that you can find, again, these theories from Nietzsche's typology to Jung's typology to thinkers and philosophers and religions that predate everything and anything modern in the last 200, 300, 400 years. You can find typology at work and discussed in various manner. Goethe, for instance, is someone who predates Nietzsche as well, who talks a lot about psychology and types because he was a phenomenal and once in an age type of psychologist himself. But setting aside all the functions and the idea of perhaps the perceiving and judging functions are where the nature meets culture, and then depending on your position in space and time and in your culture and your family, whether you even kind of have these things, is going to determine whether you wind up more judgmental or more perceptory. But even then, there's notions that it's just there's a lot to get into, but focusing on the introvert and extrovert divide, I would say that again, basically history was a zigzag away from the initial introversion. So basically, if you could think of it, that animals have intuition because animals have feeling, right? Definite sensations around pleasure and pain evolved in human biology, like all other animal biology, to drive us to behave in certain ways with each other and with the world, right? And so around that, we had the feelings, which gave rise to intuition, which I'm going to call an internal mapping or an internal framework of the world, an inner sight of the world that was developing in tandem, which what originally began as a purely sensory experience. Again, as herd animals, we all looked the same, we sounded the same, we acted the same. No different than a herd of zebras or a school of fish, and then any variable might lead to mutation, and mutation is generally fatal. Looking at us, that mutation is actually what you could argue gave birth to memory. Around feeling, intuition, thoughts and language was developed and coalesced into mythologies and stories, which birthed the human ego, the story of gods and heroes, upon which now this formerly fragile and small, weak animal now had an identity and a fortitude. And honestly, with the invention of a definitive ego and story, was also the birth of time. So all these things come packaged in one, right? It's a complex soup that is our internal bubbling brains and the emotions that surround and flood it with everything that we call modern science, how we explain the phenomenon. Because hopefully, when someone's existing out in the world and feeling how they do and thinking what they do and doing what they do, they're not, nothing about their reality is statistical to them, right? Nothing about their reality is round downable. Using a quote from George Orwell, right? The body expands to fill the universe. That's how big the ego became, to where it could paint the sun and the moon and the stars as a tragedy, even. This very gift of life itself could become understood as a pessimistic and difficult endeavor. But anyway, time was invented with ego, which was also the recognition of a playing out of personality types, which also relates to archetypes, which I mentioned in passing in the last video. But basically, the archetypes would just be, oh, these are the jobs we notice that these personality types tend towards. We worship the archetype because that's the chair, that's the throne. The people who occupy them are actually what's replaceable and what comes and goes. They are the models we're constantly improving in theory, right? That was kind of, these are the people and the figures upon which we were pursuing our bigger, better world, our land of milk and honey, our network of TV and internet. So anyway, This initial mutation happened, introversion, based around intuition and feeling, which are frameworks like I could say that other animals have intuition and this intuitive mapping. So a bird, as far as we can tell, never invented a compass, never doesn't even know what north, west, south, east is. However, when it's time, a bird does what a bird does. It flies. It knows when to fly, how to fly. No one had to teach it. No one had to remind it. It didn't have to develop an oral culture of mouth noises to then eventually be recorded by handwriting so we could say, hey, continue to remember who and what we are. For some reason, we think that's important. Nope, a bird doesn't do any of that. It doesn't have a compass, it just flies. So that's the same intuitive mapping I'm talking about, or like salmon returning to their original spawning ground, right? They don't have a story of a mighty salmon as far as we know. But that's the model that they followed to get back to the stream. Yes, a lot of them die to bears, but that's their life story. That's what we've come to see of them. So we can see all this in ways other animals can't. So with that came the success of the species. This is where we went from like this is where the beginning of from no ego to a burgeoning ego to a complete confusion of ego to where we began to believe in all sorts of permanent ideas that just weren't real or that constantly butt up against reality, whose illusion but in artwork butts up in the face of reality. Like, can't we all just get along? Aren't we all just the same? Don't we have all the same thoughts and feelings? Can't you teach people to be reasonable, rational? Can't you teach people not to cheat? And the answer is no. And history is a story of that. So I think with the success of the introvert came the success of the extrovert by proxy, because the introvert would have been the wise man who could see inside, right? Like Odin, he's a shaman warrior king. He's not some vague, he's not just playing a role. He made actual sacrifices for what he obtained, so he became prominent in the culture. So those sorts of things have long been humanly recognizable. I think in the modern day, you could look at like just the whole evolution of postmodern thought and the fact not only is modernism is dead, but that now you could even say postmodernism is dead, because now that it took us to the end of history, there's nowhere else for it to take us. So it's over as well. And that's the pre-apocalypse point, because ultimately postmodernism and its critique has nothing else to say, nothing else to offer. It just kind of reverse engineered its way to the beginning of time to get to the end of time and say, well, in a light speed media culture, there's nowhere to get to. A land of milk and honey, it's a land of manufactured milk and honey, right? Advertised milk and honey. It's all there, available for purchase and relatively cheap given the cost through history. It's just its value and meaning has been completely degraded and lost. So this boom of history, this temporary motion of time that existed once and happened once and will never happen again, that we continue to remind ourselves of for some reason, even though most of it is completely irrelevant and gone from our modern circumstances, meaning we're, what, third, fourth, fifth industrial revolution, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh generational warfare, psychic warfare, right? Battles are fought more with PR firms and advertising and marketing than they are with boots on the ground, with media cooperation and digital monopoly more than honesty and hard work and fair trading. I'm not trying to get sidetracked here. I'm pointing out, look at how the extrovertive sensory world burgeoned with the development of the body of knowledge. Even if you look to the West and say, well, look, for thousands of years, this whole process was retarded. By that I mean the church kept a lock on human thought, kept us back in that more primordial, egoless identity where they had to mediate what went in and came out of us, to where by the time we're in the modern age, there's no boundaries. Everything's dissolved. We've returned back to that tribal state of a psychedelic world that is beyond our comprehension and subject to forces that are beyond our control, even though the illusion of history was to say, hey, it's infinite, it's infinite mobilization. It's milk and honey all the way down, or milk and honey all the way up. And then it turns out you get to the end of it here, and we're right back to where we started. So that initial mutation that worked well in the beginning and then was a detriment through all history, in the sense that, well, lots of introverts were scientists who got killed for for their desire to think, their need to think, their discoveries. They were killed and regulated and silenced. So were any kind of religious figure, mystics. A lot of people don't understand why saints and Buddhists and other people go to live in the woods or temples. They think it's some esoteric understanding when it's it's an understanding of force and quietude and escaping those who would kill you out of misunderstanding and not caring to understand, because that's been human history, right? It's only the last couple hundred years, again, that anyone started to question, what are the effects of us here? Maybe we could have considered that in thousands of years of supposedly wise man history. No, it was just top down. This is how it is. And you see yet in the psychedelic world that impression of the herd, the impression of an aristocracy that's now disappeared into a classless kind of society, in the sense that, again, these are forces out of people's control, that um, the differentiation and the divide of how this all panned out, there's no reconciling those people and where they come from. They just have different experiences of the world and different perceptions, and as a result, different philosophies. So Jung winds up a psychologist and develops his theory on psychological types based on his practice. He wasn't concerned with why it is, how it came to be. He was just breaking it down. I'm saying what this whole thing was a big misunderstanding, all of it. History, where it comes from. I guess to kind of make it clearer, I had set aside this essay from called Supernatural Horror in Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. And this is to give you, I've kind of explained it a bit in my words, but to give it to you in another term, Lovecraft writes, man's first instincts and emotions formed his response to the environment in which he found himself. Definite feelings whose causes and effects he understood, whilst around those which he did not understand, and the universe teemed with personifications, right, he's talking about animism, projection, marvelous interpretations and sensations of awe and fear as would be hit upon by a race having few and simple ideas and limited experience. The unknown being likewise the unpredictable became for our primitive forefathers a terrible and omnipotent source of boons and calamities visited upon mankind for cryptic and wholly extraterrestrial reasons, and thus clearly belonging to spheres of existence whereof we know nothing and where we have no part. And this is the realm of the gods that is always imminent and ready to show itself to us and cook our noodles or blow our minds. Again, it's the Bacchae, it's Dionysus showing up and saying, hey, the revelation of the truth is an apocalypse, right? That's where the word comes from. It's Greek. Similarly, disaster literally means bad stars. So they'd look up and see a comet and be like, of course it's bad news. What we know of life is it's painful. We got toothaches. Heraclitus just died of dropsy. He was soaking in the manure and it didn't work, and now he's dead. Maybe we can rule that methodology out of our treatment list. But my point here in reading this is saying that continuing here, the unpredictable became for our primitive forefathers a terrible, right? So bad stars, right? That's just being honest, because they knew that hope was evil, even, right? The idea that things would change when they had existed long enough to build a civilization, invent art, all of which we've just copied to this very day. We invented almost very little. If you understand human consciousness and my implications of my theory, then you understand that those wise men in Greece, what they did actually understand, um, there were permanent anchors of what you would call Eastern truth or in, lasting truth. And that was an understanding that, well, look at their technology, look at what they did. In theory, they could have done what we did, the West, Christianity, all that stuff. They had the technology, they had the skills, they had the knowledge, they had the math, they had the thinking, they did more work with less than most humans ever do, especially in the modern world, especially where machines have increasingly been taking the load off. And these are the people who helped set this in motion, right? That they already came to the end of history in their own time. They saw the truth of reality, and that's art, that life is best as an aesthetic phenomenon. Art and creation is the ultimate goal, and certain things just aren't changing. So like when Heraclitus says there's no stepping into the same river twice, and it's as if some men are drunk and asleep and their opinions are like broken toys, he's not prescribing anything there. He's not saying they are awake, therefore you can wake them up and lead them to revolution. He's not saying any of that stuff. He's making the observation of, hey, we've been awake over here for a while. We've built this civilization that's the biggest, most powerful thing we know of in essence, and we've gone to war with others, and this is kind of, war is the father of all. Yeah, I'm not trying to get off in the weeds. I'm just trying to point out that basically they could have understood anything we understood now, especially if we filled them in on context and various theories and ideas. They could, or here's another way of saying it, most of those few philosophers that we remember, philosophers and historians we remember from back then, they're still better and more revolutionary and more important to history than pretty much everything that's happened between now and then, right? Because they hold the score, they hold the record that, hey, we already know what you're going to learn. All the way to Nietzsche then saying it is an eternal return, right? Why? Because we have a type, we have a typology. There were mutations that took place in a gregarious herd animal who was once a great ape, who then became the wise man, which, back to the theory, started with here's the evolution. All right, here's the mutation. Most mutations are fatal. This one still is, right? Because curiosity killed the cat and monkey see, monkey do, right? But then it bloated out, became history with the proliferation of all types to the tunes of millions and billions. Okay, now you've just spread out that number. So now you got 25% introverts, 75% extroverts, and they still don't understand or see one another, except those who are privy to these types and how this worked out. But basically, it ballooned out to the point of breaking the illusion that it was ever going to go somewhere, or that the beliefs behind, the emotions behind, or in front of the motives being that everyone's got their confession, they are in it for themselves. We know that. So at the end of the day, when we know that, and we've seen that time and time again to the point of nihilism, knowing that there was no purpose, there was no reason, it could have just as been anyone or anything else, so on and so forth, right? The chance element, even though there doesn't seem to be such a thing as chance, given how not just genetics but time and space are perceived, right? That things play out in the reasons that they do following some natural law, even if that itself changes over time and isn't understood. So we had all these rules and laws with this expansion of the species, overtake the planet, nowhere left to go, no more, only so many mirrors and masks and veils you can put up before, as the knowledge and the time piles up, and we have thousands of case studies over thousands of years into the present day with people living, acting, and putting their lives and their personalities online daily, going to war daily, doing all the things that the mundane things humans have always done daily for all time. Now that we have this, now that this information is piled up, that veil, that illusion, that form of cultural repression that formerly worked to keep a more simple-minded primate in check for a few short years so it could reproduce and sustain the culture, all that's shifted, all that's changed, all that's blown away, especially for those who do have that introverted or intuitive orientation in their psychological type. And to kind of put the capstone here, thinking was the last thing we ever did. So back when we were animistic herd creatures, there was no thought at all. We wouldn't even consider them human because they hadn't developed thought. So that's the neocortex. It's the newest part of the brain, but arguably, back to what I said in the initial basis of this theory, is that between feeling stemming from intuition, stemming from feeling, stemming from sensation, eventually gave birth to thought. It's the instincts, Mother Nature given a articulated voice who makes meaning of its own songs and sounds, right? We see birds just singing. They're doing what a bird does, right? And they have that internal and external reflection as far as we can tell. Not sure about inventing plastics and coffee filters and those kinds of things, but the fundamental process is the same. Yet with us, we have personality types. So with the development of that brain, clearly it tells you there's something about the dynamics of a herd animal who, from its stupidity and ignorance and arrogance, and weakness grew strength and intelligence, and began to cultivate and choose and select for, and then that led, and it led to the cultivation and development of beauty, which is art, which is that we find the human form beautiful enough that we want to mate with it, right? That, nature has these clever, crafty ways of, uh, go, I don't want to say nature is quintessentially a seductress, that the looking inwards was a seduction all along. So it makes sense that the story with Eve and the snake, but that's denying her agency. And I do believe that intuitiveness and intuition based on strong feelings did evolve more strongly in women. And this is why I say the whole thing is actually, when it comes to typology, it's a battle of the sexes. From the fringes of any society or culture come the barbarians, come the outsiders, right? So unless your civilization can keep all these forces in check, just eventually history and time gets you, and these things keep eternally recurring as far as humanity is concerned. It's just now that with Leviathan to encircle the globe, people go, how can you have history when history means war, when history means powerful weapons that could destroy the planet and the species? So again, we see how that initial mutation burgeoned out to overly successful, right? This is your Zaphian cultural repression territory, back to reality, realizing, oh, there are eternal truths here, and who are the people who are concerned with them? Or are they more concerned about making a buck? And then you see, based on personality type, again, thinking being the most recent one, the development of systematized and sets of codes, laws, ways of doing conduct and experimentation in all sorts of manners to come to various conclusions that at least hold true to some application in the world, because generally man's concerned with the practical applications of these things. Now, again, I wanted to get into reading the conscious and unconscious attitudes of the introvert and the extrovert because they are so night and day different. But more importantly was to lay out the groundwork for this theory. So to recap before I end here, basically, here it's still misconceived, and I'm still leaving out a few things. We're not concerned about functions just yet. Those are too many detailed complexities. Well, I mentioned them a little bit in terms of some sort of order and affect, right? In terms of conception and model and what that relates to and results in. But basically, we were a herd primate. We were a great ape. We couldn't think. We could feel, we could sense, we could look at the world with eyes that could only see outwardly and live in this moment, right? Just it was an animal present in the moment. It didn't know what time was, didn't know what ego was. From there began to develop inwardly to this mutation that was introversion and intuition. Then that led to the bolstering of the ego and warfare and the development of further bodies of knowledge in politics and peoples, which led to the expansion of history, which was the dominance of the extroverted sensory type, which then kind of collapsed back into the modern day, going, oh crap, we don't have enough resources in the world to provide a middle class existence for everyone. So these people over here make 50 cents a day, you over here make $7 an hour, and a few people over here get everything, right? It's just kind of how it panned out. But back to what it is that thinking, again, I can't hammer this enough, that thinking was the final one, the recent one. That actually evolved, arguably, to fight against the irrational side, right? The priestly castes, the shamans, to correct, to amend, because it's kind of like a beehive, it seems. And that's when I mention these numbers pan out with beehives in the sense that you have all these drones and they're all supposed to go do one thing. And so most of them do. They all go do the one thing, and that's collect nectar to make honey. Now, that's 75% of bees do that. 35% of bees, or maybe it's 25 or 35, I don't remember the exact numbers, but 25% of bees, they fly like crazy. They just go zoop, zap, zoopity bop right off into the whatever they're doing. And at first it confused scientists, and scientists were like, geez, why are these bees stupid? And then it turns out the scientists were stupid or ignorant, meaning they didn't understand the behavior. No different than how humans, and especially introverts and intuitives, which leads to conversations on autists and what I think is a misdiagnosis or a medical farce, and kind of butchery called the diagnosis of ADHD, because the brain isn't a condition. The brain is part of the body. The brain's a unique structure. None of them are the same. And then we have these mutations that make our brains different. So the whole thing is like totally messed up, and I hope you guys see that. But from there, I would say, regardless, the implications of all these theories throw all these things into question. That's the bigger thing here, is I'm questioning how wrong is everybody, because I think pretty much, other than a basic understanding of psychological types, in turn the psychological and medical treatment of people is completely arbitrary. You might as well have great apes trying to take apart a human being. So that's where my mind goes there. I know there's people who further develop the work, but again, to think that this could have been developed thousands of years ago, but you wouldn't have been able to do that for most of Christian history, even, right? Because psychology was not relevant to living a life predicated on mythological masking and illusions and acting, right? Based on a false belief or an erroneous belief, or assumption, and however you want to phrase it. But anyway, I think I've kind of gone over it enough, but I'm really trying to make it clear and offer it up for examination to whoever wants to run with it, further develop it, question it, argue about it. That's why it needs to happen. It always needs to happen. That initial mutation. This is so this is where it gets weird, because then as subspecies, regardless of how our functions work, we see how in our actions how we're oriented. So some people create and live by their own values or die trying, and other people, they go and collect the nectar and the honey like they have to, or like they're supposed to, like they're supposed to, because it's a personality type. It seems like they couldn't not do that even if they wanted. What else was history? People enacting their wills upon one another. It was never a matter of free will, because everyone was ambered in their time. It was a matter of strong or weak wills, people forcing themselves. So coming full circle, we had that mutation. It means that right now we're on our way to our next mutation. It's just we mistook what it was. People are still waiting for some further enlightenment. No, I'm saying everything possible for enlightenment was already made available thousands and hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's just people were never in a position to pursue that way of life, and to develop practices and methods to develop a physiology that could better cope with a more sophisticated world. This is why I say that initial mutation becomes an advantage, because in an increasingly complex world, while having internal measures of things like people's thoughts, feelings, general conceptions, language, it's kind of in the vein of my image consulting work, but that this becomes an advantage again. That yes, people will still stone you to death in certain places, or like yes, witches will still get burned at the stake. Yes, people still get forced and coerced into everything about life and culture. But I'm just pointing out that now we can see the divides, and part of that is realizing then that the extroverted sensory type. So if we're basically subspecies within a species. We're all Homo sapiens, but we're still subspecies based on our psychological types. Other alternatives would likely be worse, because then you'd be saying extroverts were the previous species, then introverts and intuitives became the new species. It's a mutation that you can't have a population of a social animal that is 100% this type. Nature has proved is not going to work by the fact that they either died off on their own accord, curiosity killing the cat, or them being burned at the stake by the masses, or strung up, or just the thing that political regimes and people and families do to each other as a matter of course, as known and studied through all of human history, going back to Greek gods and others who preceded them, right? Everything from just all sorts of randy behavior. You could say all sorts of taboo behavior. And I think that about rounds us out here. Um, again, I wasn't concerned with putting it in any specific order, in the sense that I'm saying this is it, this is the final word, because that's not how a body of knowledge works. It's further developed. The work is further carried on by others if they find it and think of it as worthwhile or important or relevant to their life. So this has been the theory of evolution that the world is not ready for. And that's that our psychological types as a species, actually render a subspecies within our species. And I think that's about it. Maybe next time I'll finally get to the unconscious or conscious attitudes as Jung lays them out. But in the meantime, you're here, like, share, subscribe. I think you actually have to hit the bell notification to get notified when new content is uploaded, even though it seems like on my channel I have that enabled and the notifications are just weird. They never show up on time, they never show up when people upload. So I'm not even, this platform seems pretty kind of screwy or unreliable. But anything like that, I appreciate your support of the channel, and I hope wherever this finds you, it finds you well. And I'll catch you on the next one, maybe. Take care. Bye.